I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about Object Oriented Ontology. If a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If no one sees it falling, has it fallen? Does it even exist? A layman would unhesitatingly reply in the positive, but in philosophy the answer is not so certain. S.A.S. Pakipi wrote George Berkeley in the 18th century. To be is to be perceived, according to him. Hence, if the tree fell but no one saw it, it did not actually fall, in his account. In fact, it did not actually exist. All that exists is in the mind of the perceiver, according to idealism, a theory pioneered by Berkeley. Object-oriented ontology takes the opposite tack, taking the status of objects seriously, not just as things that human beings interact with and manipulate. Even if there are no conscious beings in existence, things will still exist. Reality is not a cultural phenomenon, and the external world exists independently of human awareness. A good way to begin to understand what object-oriented ontology is about is to examine its three terms. By object, things are meant, just any object at all. By oriented, it means that the theories of object-oriented ontology are centered around the object and not upon, for instance, the observer of the object. As for ontology, it is a branch of metaphysics. Metaphysics studies the nature of reality, while ontology is narrower, focusing on the nature of being or the nature of what exists, of things. Hence, the main idea behind object-oriented ontology is to take the status of objects seriously, understanding that even if observers of the object did not exist, the object still does. However, can we ever get in touch with the nature of things? Once again, to the layman, the answer seems obvious. We interact with things based on their known properties all the time. We boil water for our tea, knowing that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. We know that the table we are working on is made of wood, and our cup is red in color. While that may be the case, we only know all these things through our cognitive apparatus. We take in the sense data through our sensory apparatus, our five senses such as our eyes and ears. This data, the light reflected off the cup, is then processed in our cognitive apparatus such as our central nervous system and brain to tell us that the cup is red. However, do we really know that the cup is red? Or is color merely a relation between human beings and objects? Does the cup appear red, for instance, to dogs which have only 2 types of cone cells in their eyes, compared to 3 in human beings, such that dogs are effectively colorblind to red and green? Hence, is the redness we perceive a function of how we are as human beings, or is the cup truly red in itself? In the case of the cup's color, red is indeed merely a human perception. Yet we can never be able to perceive the world without the processing of the filters of our cognitive apparatus. These filters are not something we can take off like goggles or earphones to truly view the cup in pure objectivity. Hence, Immanuel Kant concluded in the 18th century that we can never get to the thing in itself, which he calls noumena. All we can perceive are only phenomena. A basic contention of object-oriented ontology is that regardless of how any observer may perceive or interact with an object, the object is its own being, more than how it is apprehended by any observer. Let us look at the basic principles of object-oriented ontology according to Graham Harman in his 2017 book Object-Oriented Ontology, A New Theory of Everything. I would first read out the 7 principles on their own and then elaborate on them subsequently. 1. All objects must be given equal attention, whether they be human, non-human, natural, cultural, real, or fictional. 2. Objects are not identical with their properties, but have a tense relationship with those properties, and this very tension is responsible for all of the change that occurs in the world. 3. Objects come in just two kinds. Real objects exist, whether or not they currently affect anything else, while sensual objects exist, only in relation to some real object. 4. Real objects cannot relate to one another directly, but only indirectly, by means of a sensual object. 5. The properties of objects also come in just two kinds, again real and sensual. 6. These two kinds of objects and two kinds of qualities lead to four basic permutations. 7. Philosophy has a closer relationship with aesthetics than with mathematics or natural science. So let us turn to the first principle. All objects must be given equal attention, whether they be human, non-human, natural, cultural, real, or fictional. Given that the ones analyzing objects are human beings, there is a tendency to give a lot of weight to the human side of the equation and less to the objects under study, the way Kant did. He is not unique in such biased analysis. Most philosophers indeed are human-centric, which is not a surprise, since we are human beings and are concerned with what and how things affect us. However, in doing this, we may lose sight that objects have their own reality, even if we are unable to perceive those aspects of their reality. Much of philosophy discusses human beings in relation to the world, so while we are just one among many objects in the universe, we take up a large part of the knowledge discourse, even though we constitute only a very small percentage of things in the universe, making ourselves an extra important type of being. Hence, Harman advocates a flat ontology, where all things should in principle initially get equal attention, since while humans, animals, and plants may be different, a human is not more a human than a plant is a plant. They are all equally substances. Principle number 2. Objects are not identical with their properties, but have a tense relationship with those properties, and this very tension is responsible for all of the change that occurs in the world. In our usual analysis of objects, there are two opposing tendencies, which Harman calls undermining and overmining. Undermining is when we reduce a thing to its components, to what it is made of, for instance atoms, molecules, cells, or parts. While an object is indeed made out of molecules, not all its properties can be known just from understanding what its molecules are and how they behave. Higher order characteristics may arise which cannot be known from lower order characteristics. For instance, examining our neurons cannot tell us how pain, love, or even color feels. Analyzing only the parts of an object may not tell us how the total object is. An example Harman gives is marriage. A marriage is comprised of two people. Analyzing these two people who are the components of the marriage separately will not tell us about the marriage. Just because they are individually miserable does not mean that their marriage will also be one of misery. Another tendency in our theoretical analysis is overmining, where we reduce a thing to its relations, to what it does. Harman's example is a house builder. The person we call house builder is indeed a house builder, but that does not exhaust all her characteristics. She may also be a mother, lover, daughter, artist, or avid stamp collector. Yet there is a tendency to oversimplify people into, for instance, their professions, as if that alone defines them. However, even if you take all her characteristics, of being a house builder, mother, daughter, and so on, it still does not exhaustively describe her. An object is more than a bundle of its qualities, since those who advocate the bundle theory, like David Hume, are unable to account for the substrate that holds these properties together. The object precedes its qualities despite not being able to exist without them, writes Harman. Things first exist, then they take on their qualities and relations. Besides, relations are incidental in the life of things, writes Harman. Even if a piano never has any relations to a pianist, that is, it is never played, it remains a piano. Both overmining and undermining oversimplify their objects of study, reducing them to less than what they really are. Object Oriented Ontology is also opposed to a literalist view of objects. It is not possible to capture completely the nature of the object through a literal description, say in a paragraph or even an entire book describing its characteristics. Say you try to capture everything about an apple you are holding in a sentence. I'm holding a red fruit, crunchy when bitten into and filled with a sweet juice, you may say. Others may recognize you are talking about an apple, but yet that apple is more than just what you had said. Even if you had further elaborated, including its weight, its waxy feel, the small leaf at the end of its stem, the day it fell from the tree, your description still will not exhaust everything about it. Principle 3. Objects come in just two kinds. Real objects exist whether or not they currently affect anything else, while sensual objects exist only in relation to some real object. Object-oriented ontology makes a distinction between the real object, the object in itself, and the sensual object, or the objects that we sense. Back to the apple example, we may sense with our vision its color, with our taste buds, its sweetness, and so on, but those sense perceptions exist only in the relation between us and the apple. Yet if no one experiences the apple as a sensual object, it still is itself as a real object. Principle number 4. Real objects cannot relate to one another directly but only indirectly by means of a sensual object. Just as human beings cannot get to the noumena or the thing in itself, objects also withdraw from one another. We may encounter the apple in our example through our senses as a sensual object, but we can never encounter the apple in itself as a real object, as already explained by Kant. Principle number 5. The properties of objects also come in just two kinds, again, real and sensual. This suggests that there are properties of objects which we can perceive, which are its sensual properties, for instance, the sweet taste of the apple or its red color. There are then also other properties which are no less real but are unperceived by us or perceived indirectly. Principle number 6. These two kinds of objects and two kinds of qualities lead to 4 basic permutations. Harman makes a distinction between sensuous objects, sensuous qualities, real objects, and real qualities. Real objects and qualities exist in their own right, while sensual objects and qualities exist only as the correlate of some other real object, whether human or otherwise, he writes. There is the sensual object with sensual properties, which we can sense to get to the sensual object. The apple feels like a certain weight in my hand, its skin waxy to my touch, and its flavor sweet to my taste. That is my sensual experience of the apple as a sensual object. But what then are the real qualities of the real object? It seems as if we need to try to get into the inner life of the object under study in order to learn its real qualities, to try to get at what it is like to be that thing, be it a plastic bag or a bat. Principle number 7. Philosophy has a closer relationship with aesthetics than with mathematics or natural science. As already explained, under and over mining does not give us the thing in itself. Yet such under and overmining are often the procedures of the natural sciences and mathematics, where objects are reduced to their mathematical relations. For instance, to calculate the trajectory of two billiard balls colliding, or to explain the taste of an apple by reducing that sensation of sweetness to the chemical structure of the molecules of the apple. Harman contends that science is hence insufficient to give us the ontology of things, while philosophy is able to. How philosophy does this is through the aesthetic experience. One way we can gain access to the real object is through art. In art, sensual qualities no longer belong to their usual sensual object, but are transferred instead to a real object, the canvas, which necessarily withdraws from all access. For this reason, the vanished real object is replaced by the aesthetic beholder herself or himself as the new real object that supports the sensual qualities, writes Harman. When an artist paints an apple, he is not creating an apple, but paints a representation of an apple onto the canvas. He transfers the sensual qualities of the apple he perceives onto another object, the canvas, but the canvas is not the object of interest, real and sensuous as it is. The real object in this situation is the artist as the experiencer of the sensuous apple. Perhaps this can be better understood when we consider metaphor as the aesthetic form instead of painting. Harman's metaphor is a cypress is like the ghost of a dead flame. Let's simplify that to a cypress is like a flame. Clearly, the object, cypress, is not a flame. It is, however, like a flame. It has a flame-like quality, but we must not understand this literally. A cypress is not burning like a flame ordinarily, nor is it bright like a flame. Yet its shape resembles the shape of a flame. The real object of the cypress is here replaced by a metaphor. Yet to truly understand the metaphor, we, the listener, needs to stand in for the absent cypress and support its freshly anointed flame qualities. The metaphor as an aesthetic form replaces the absent cypress with us ourselves as the real object that embraces the qualities of the flame. In such an aesthetic way, we can approach the real cypress object, albeit indirectly. Harman does not mention Arthur Schopenhauer in this work, which is unfortunate, since Schopenhauer's theory of metaphysics and art would have enriched Harman's Object Oriented Ontology. Following from Kant, we can only observe phenomena and never get to the noumena. However, there is a being that we experience inwardly as well as outwardly, which is ourselves. We can observe our body moving outwardly, but we also experience our will internally willing our body to move. So Schopenhauer thinks Kant is not correct to say that we can never experience the thing in itself, since we experience ourselves as a thing in itself. Because we have such an inner experience of our will as the essence of being in ourselves, we know likewise that other objects also possess their own will or essence in themselves. However, we ordinarily have no access to their will. Yet according to Schopenhauer, some artists who are geniuses have the ability to penetrate through to the will of the objects they depict. And then in their skilled painting of the objects, their work of art also allows the viewer to assess the essence of the object through the artist's point of view. Or consider Harman's example of the method actor who tries to inhabit his character. Say his character is a thief. Presumably the actor has not been a thief before and hence has no experience of what being a thief is like. However, he tries to understand thieves by going to speak to real thieves, watching them doing their work of stealing, trying to imitate their motions, and try to get into their mind to think the way that they think. While the actor will never be able to completely understand what it is to be a thief short of becoming a thief, he may get close, at least closer than any mathematical equation of a thief or a molecule by molecule scientific description of the molecules of the thief's body. Hence, in this way, art brings us closer to the object in itself than science. In conclusion, the main lesson of Object Oriented Ontology is a powerful, though almost commonsensical one, that objects have their own reality, existing not just in relation to us or other things, but in themselves. Our usual human-centric approach tends to subordinate objects to ourselves, where we do not consider the object as a thing in itself, but just what it is for us, how we can use it and what it can do for us. Because we do not consider the object in its own right, we forget that objects also have their own needs. For example, nature is an ecosystem where some of its species need for nourishment what we consider as pests. So for instance, if we annihilate all flies, the frogs will also perish from lack of food, which then leads animals that depend on frogs to suffer. Or because of urban encroachment into natural habitats, we get rid of beehives, but flowers need bees to pollinate them, and hence we may harm the vegetation also. Harman's solution of the aesthetic as access to the object in itself requires the artist to have the genius to inhabit the object. Henri Bergson, in his Introduction to Metaphysics, published over a century before, in 1903, has a similar idea. We can know an object externally, but to really know the object, we need to somehow penetrate into the object, to enter into the object. Take for instance, we want to know about bats. Since we cannot actually become a bat, all we can do is to use our imagination to be in an intellectual sympathy with the states of the object. This is just like the method actor whose character is a thief, using his skills in observing actual thieves, putting himself into their situations through the use of his imagination, to try to walk in their shoes so as to understand how they feel, and why they do what they do in an open spirit of empathy and not judgment. Say the actor is a rich man who has never encountered a thief before, or if he had, was the victim of theft. Hence he may at the start have an animus towards thieves, regarding them as evil people. Yet if he acts out his role from that perspective, he may be unconvincing, acting how he thinks evil people behave. If he tries, however, to walk in their shoes, to understand what made them turn to a life of crime, for instance an inability to hold down a job because of a lack of qualifications, or substance abuse problems, or perhaps being forced by unfortunate circumstances, he may realize that they may not be evil, but really are not so different from himself. Because he now imaginatively inhabits his role, taking on criminal intentions, but also the difficult circumstances that led his character to become a criminal, he may be able to act out his role more convincingly. When his movie is watched, the audience also can experience through the actor the pathos of the thief, and in that way experience the thief's life for those moments at least. It is not the real thing, as Harman, Kant, and Schopenhauer notes, since it does not exhaust everything about the object in itself, but at least it brings us closer than a mathematical or scientific description is able to do. This is an important takeaway. Art and philosophy may be able to bring us closer to reality than science and mathematics can. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.